Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom with Bob Olson, who will now introduce today's show and speaker.
Presenting the open door. I have left an open door before you, which no one can close. Open to the love of God. Open to joining His stream of love for others. Now here's our panel that you'll be hearing today. Dr. Rhonda Chervin, Professor of Philosophy and Catholic writer in Corpus Christi, Texas. Dr. Jim Hannock from Los Angeles, Philosophy Professor, father of 5 children, pro-life activist, editor of New Oxford Review. And Commander Al Hughes from Corpus Christi, Texas, a colonel in the Air Force, a married father who converted to the Catholic Church from being an agnostic, and also has degrees in engineering and in pastoral studies. Now here he is, Commander Al.
Thank you, Bob. I think we're going to have a rollicking good time today with a most controversial subject. We're going to be speaking about just war theory, and we're already hot and heavy to it in the pregame show here. So, how do we deal with the just war theory, panel?
Yeah, you see, we're ready to roll. Well, let me say this to start. Many people criticize the just war theory, thinking that since no wars are just, why talk about a just war theory? But it could well be that some war or other is just, and because the just war theory is stringent, has requirements with teeth in it, I think it would be a mistake to give up on the theory itself. I'll say that much to start us off.
Oh, okay. Well, just on that question, many people who don't think World War I was a just war do think World War II was a just war on the basis that a totalitarian maniac was determined to take over the entire world. And so now, of course, that's not the only aspect, because besides it being just in its intentions, there are also other things that come into the just war theory as criteria. But that's just for starters. I wanted to mention that.
Yeah, Al, I think we need to keep, well, there are 2 subjects here, and we need to keep them separated. One is the question of, is it just to go into a particular war? Once in the war, the rules change, and that's a whole different discussion about what should or should not be done when you're already in the war. So I think we need to keep those 2. We can talk about them, but keep sure that which topic we're really talking about.
That distinction is oftentimes referred to as the distinction between use ad bellum, justice or rightness in going into the war, what's the intention, and use in bello, justice or right in the course of waging the war.
Yeah, once in it, the rules change, and the only rule is when, because no second place in war.
Well, that seems to be the Hughes rule rather than the just war rule.
Well, right, yeah, and there are books written on the principles of warfare, but that's what I'm saying. That's a different subject. The question is, what kind of war should we be? Is it moral to get into in the first place?
No, well, actually, if you go to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, you'll see the summary of the just war theory, which was originally promulgated by St. Augustine. And, more or less. Anyway, so based on natural law ethics that comes all the way back to the Greeks and Romans, etc., etc. But in any case, it is there in the Catechism it lists the different aspects of the theory, and by no means does it say that what you do within the war, once you're in it, the rules change. Even when I was teaching this subject first at Loyola Marymount University, I decided I would take the trouble before I taught the course to have a nice long talk with the head of the ROTC to see what they think. And I was very surprised that the ROTC actually, in its documented principles, insists on this question. Now, that doesn't mean they follow it all the time, but it insists that people are not expected to go against their conscience just because they're in the war and they have to obey the general whatever and stuff like that. So that was very, very helpful for me.
Another consideration is that in exploring, looking at the ethical dimension of, that is to say, the foundational dimension of a particular war, it could be that a war is just for the most part in the way it's waged and just clearly in the end for which it is raised. But a given combatant in a given situation might be given in order to do something that is wrong, and then from the perspective of that individual at that time, at that place, regardless of the overall justice of the war with regard to its end or its means, that person has an obligation and conscience to not accept the order given.
And that's actually recognized in the military. Of course, we follow orders, but an illegal order or an immoral order, we are expected to resist, particularly an illegal order. It doesn't happen very often, but it can and does. And in that case, the one being ordered needs to decline. Of course, he'd better be right what he does, because if it's a serious matter, he'll find himself before a military court. But the courts also understand this issue of conscience, and if they deem that the order was either immoral or unlawful, or both, then they will side with the troop that resisted.
And we would think that the foundation of what would be legal or moral, recognized by a military court, we would think that the foundation of that would be something other than what, say, the government has decided it should be, or arm of the branch of the military has decided it should be, or even other than international courts should decide it to be, because international courts might get it wrong, a particular government might get it wrong. So there has to be some deeper foundation. And that deeper foundation takes us back to what we would call jus in bello, right or wrong in the waging of the war. So if you're in the Philippines right now, the individual in charge of the government might very well say that soldiers should do whatever his commanding officer says to do, period, stop. Or should do whatever his commanding officer says to do and turn the bayonet twice rather than just once, or whatever. For example, we know that the commander-in-chief of the military in the Philippines right now says that if you catch a drug dealer, kill him, period, stop. And there's no question of due process.
Yeah.
Okay, that question of due process, alarmed me recently. I'm in the following situation for listeners who don't know me, where I've retired and I no longer have a Catholic university library to go through. I usually go through the lives of the saints A to Z while I'm at a given place. for light reading or spiritual reading. Okay. So, but I have another library available to me from a friend here. So I happen to be reading a book from that library about the Polish underground during World War II. And the Catholic who wrote this book was a rather famous man, though I hadn't heard of him, called Jan Karski. And he became an international figure because he was part of the Polish underground government. He was busy as a liaison, living in Poland, but going to France and England, where the true Polish government had set up headquarters to report on what was going on in Poland and in the underground in Poland. Now, he's a strong Catholic. Among other things, in the underground, anyone who is in it has to swear that they will carry always inside their shirt a vial of poison, that they will immediately commit suicide if captured by the Gestapo. So now, does the church allow suicide under such circumstances? I mean, we know the church doesn't say every spy is in mortal sin because they use false names. So we know that whatever that is, that's allowed by the church. In itself, it's not a sin to be a spy, right? Because all spies have to do that. But I've never heard anything about this thing. So the idea that you could do something which is otherwise immoral because you're in a critical situation where the enemy is doing 5 times more horrible things, like concentration camps. And I had never read this particular description about this Nazi concentration camp that he visited pretending to be an Estonian janitor. So he goes into the concentration camp dressed as an Estonian and gets in, and what they would do, I've heard of gas chambers, of course, but what they would do is they force 1,000 Jews into trains, put lye and different substances into the trains such that the fumes of this would kill them all by the time the train reached the pit where they were going to throw them in. Stuff like this. And just absolutely horrible stuff. Okay. Yeah, so on the basis of the ends justify the means, the idea would be, which we don't believe as Catholics, the idea would be in fighting for this, you can't, under torture, you're likely to betray your fellow underground prisoners, so the minute they catch you, you drink the poison. So,
let me get into that a bit. You could look at this case of suicide in those circumstances as giving one's life for others, which becomes a very holy act.
Well, you could, but I'm wondering Jim, would you think that would be true?
No.
I didn't think so.
Why not?
I'd like to back up on it's okay to tell a lie if you're a spy. No rhyme intended. You, first of all, want to think about spying in the context of what's going on. Suppose you're spying in the context of a war. If your government is waging war unjustly, you oughtn't to be a spy. So that would eliminate probably half of all spies. If you are asked to do something that is a complete action in itself, such as taking your own life, then regardless of the justice of the war, you're being asked to do something wrong. There's a occupational hazard here in analysis of describing an action in terms of its end, as in its further end, and overlooking that any specific action already has an end. And technically, the end of any specific action is called its object. What's the object of this action? Well, if somebody says, I'm going to kill myself, well, that's a specific action, and it has a specific end or object bringing about one's death. Oops, I dropped the pill, I better pick it up and take it. So if you say, and I'm doing that to save Western civilization, well, that'd be a good reason to do it, but it's wrong in and of itself. The further end is fine. The immediate end, that is to say the object of the act, disqualifies it. And in Veritatis Splendor, the Pope is very specific about saying that each act has to be judged by its object, and that's also classical Thomistic thought, which calls to mind, just because Rhonda wants to keep it light, Al and I want to duke it out, but just because Rhonda wants to keep it light, when Samuel Johnson went against his will, really, to Europe, because he didn't like to leave London, knowing that he who tires of London is tired of life. When he went to Europe, he was able to converse with such people as Voltaire in Latin, and Voltaire complimented him on his Latin. And Johnson said, why, sir, I should know Latin. My master beat me well. And when Voltaire raised his eyebrows, Johnson said, and in beating me, he said, this I do to save you from the gallows. But even if you think that beating a Latin student to save them from the gallows is worthwhile, it's really wrong to beat people.
Okay, an immediate one which Al will understand perfectly is you can't say that because my purpose is to avoid bringing a baby who is deformed into this world because the baby will suffer for years. So that's my end, my objective, and therefore I'm going to abort the baby. Because abortion itself is the killing of the innocent baby, you can't do it on the basis of having a good motive, quote.
In Iceland, and this is not changing the subject, they currently are bragging, government ministries are bragging, because they don't have a problem, they say, any longer with Down syndrome children. They've had 100% success in aborting Down syndrome children. There are no more Down syndrome genetic problems. It's all been taken care of.
Wonderful. I think we are sliding away from the subject of the defining a just war, huh?
All right.
Well, not really, because always, for instance, a preemptive strike, which is part of. Now, you see, you have the original just war theory in St. Augustine, but then you have, all sorts of moral theologians working on specific applications of principles. So you get something like preemptive strike. So one thing is, how do you define a preemptive strike? So it seems very simple if you're just thinking of France and England in the Middle Ages. Then preemptive strike is without any Frenchman ever sending a bullet across the channel or throwing a sword across the English Channel. You go over to take over northern France, okay? That's a preemptive strike. That's very clear. But when you're dealing with something but then when you think of something like ISIS has announced they're going to take over Mosul this year, is it a preemptive strike if, the government bombs their military base? You see, that gets very complicated. I would say no.
And again, it sounds to me like you keep sliding into the subject of we're already at war and what's just, rather than should we be in the war at all. But there's another complexity here too, and that is, and this has happened since World War II. Used to be in the good old days, people gentlemanly declared war against one another and duked it out like a dueling pistols on a huge scale. That doesn't work anymore. Even in Korea, we never called that a war. We called it a police action, which is an oxymoron. But anyway, that's what we called it. And we have never had a declared war since then, though we've been in many. We use one euphemism or another, but we just kind of slide into it or get dragged into it. And there are no niceties like there were with the Geneva Convention. So we get confused, and then on top of that, Mao and others have invented guerrilla warfare, which has now become terrorism, and now it's hard to even define what a war is anymore, much less whether it's just. And yet, ISIS and others have very specifically laid out their end goal, which is annihilation of Christianity and the caliphate, and developing a caliphate. So I wonder what the definition of a just war can be in such chaotic, undefined situations.
Well, a couple of thoughts here. What do you make of this? Sometimes wars are declared, and so then the situation isn't so chaotic. And quite apart from that, what counts as a war really isn't the words uttered by this government or that government, but rather by what's actually happening. So Russia could say, for example, that war in Crimea, war in Ukraine can't be so. We're not even there. Well, if you have pictures of them there and pictures of them engaged in acts of war, they have engaged in a war. They've parties to a war, and whether they admit it or not is neither here nor there. I mean, somebody can steal something, and everybody can deny that it's being stolen, or a government could repossess something, and everybody in the government could say, oh no, we're not repossessing this, but if it was held by such and such a group and now it's held by representatives of the government, it really doesn't make any difference whether the government says they haven't done it or not. Fact is, they have.
Oh, wait a minute. So when we, that is, the Pilgrims and the Hispanics, took over the lands of the Native Americans, we don't consider that they now have rights to retaliate, do we?
Well, first of all, the discussion has to, well, we're realists, right? The world is real. What God created is real. We seek value in what is real. We're at every level through and through realists. So here we have various bands of Native Americans, various bands of indigenous people. And I think by natural law, if they've worked and maintained an area, they have certain rights to that area. Now, not absolute rights. I mean, what if immigrants come into that area that are in desperate need of material resources to live? Well, then they ought to share. But when we look at it at that level, if we have a group of indigenous people and they're attacked, they have a right to defend themselves within certain limits. They can't, for example, steal down in the course of the night and burn the entire encampment of invaders, including men, women, and children, knowing that nobody will have a chance to escape, because that would be the indiscriminate use of retaliatory force.
Oh, very good, very good. So, now what about the question of, which is most Catholics look into this issue, for instance, during the rite of initiation, someone who wants to convert, and they're looking into the catechism and they're looking into this issue. Their concern is, if I am, now that we don't have a draft, but their concern is, if I enlist in the armed forces, what do I have to know in order to decide whether I should object to any particular war and not enlist because I don't think it's a just war? So one angle of this that came up when I first taught this subject was I had a woman in my class who was in the ROTC, and she was being trained to be one of these people who sits with the button in front of her to push the button on a nuclear war.
And she would say, why not? Why not?
No. What she said, in a minute she answered my question. She said, I would immediately leave leave my position and the armed forces if there was a president who I didn't trust. That was a very interesting answer, but then comes the question, since most of us don't trust the news media very much, we think there's fake news, etc., how do you determine if you trust the president, especially since many of the decisions he's going to make are going to be secret?
Based on secret information, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that idea of, if I don't trust the president, first of all, she's talking about somebody she actually doesn't know. So how do you make that decision whether to trust or not when you don't know the person and you're swamped with the false news reports and exaggerated news reports and a media that's out to get the president anyway? That's getting us back into politics, which I think we ought to avoid. But my invite is, well, if you don't like it, go to Canada. we'll go along with us. But by the way, your idea of push the button and start the war, that almost happened, but not here. It was in Russia. I don't know if you know this story, but I've seen a documentary on it. A lieutenant colonel in the missile forces of Russia, who was at a console like I've done in my past, and he was in control of a reconnaissance satellite, which in the middle of the night one night alerted him that the United States was starting a mass missile attack against Russia, reporting hundreds of missiles. And, of course, he reported it, as he should, and up the ladder, and the order came back to initiate war on the Russian side. And he didn't do it. He looked at data from the satellite, and he listened to what the Politburo was saying and his fellow officers, and he waited. And sure enough, the satellite was broke. There was no war going. And he was court-martialed by the Russians.
Oh, wait a minute, I didn't get it. The satellite was broke?
Yeah, it was getting false information.
What? He was, okay. He was,
listen, Wanda, listen. Don't
no,
talk,
you didn't say he was given false information. You said it was broke. I didn't know what that meant.
Yeah, it means it said false information.
Okay.
It was sending an alert that was not based on reality. Anyway, he was court-martialed. They realized that he had prevented World War III, and yet he had disobeyed an order. So what's the poor old court to do? Well, they admonished him severely and allowed him to retire with honors.
This was what year?
This was, I'll have to guess, about 85, 86. It was before the Soviet Union collapsed.
Okay, very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and something similar happened in the U.S. Navy. I think it was 1923. There was a squadron of destroyers going up the west coast in fog, and this is, of course, before radar. They're in deep fog along the coast, and they made the lead ship commanded a turn to port to make the corner and go down towards Santa Barbara. And so he made the turn, and all the ships following. The very last ship in the rear just felt like something was wrong. He disobeyed. He went straight. He was the only one that survived. All the other ships piled up on the rocks at what is now Vandenberg Air Force Base. And you can still see the piece of the ship out there. Nevertheless, he had disobeyed an order to turn left, turn to port. So they court-martialed him, and in this case, they put him in jail. He saved his ship and wound up in jail. Anyway,
so the plot thickens. So the plot thickens. So trying to go from these fascinating events, facts, to the principles, back to the principles.
Yeah.
So evidently, the idea would be that you could not have armed forces at all. You couldn't have a military situation in which every lower echelon person made up their own minds about every situation. This is called Kant's categorical imperative. Act so that you could universalize the principle. So if because of incidences like this you universalize the principle that every person in charge of any military situation should not obey orders automatically, but should try to figure out the whole situation themselves, you couldn't have a military, right?
That's correct. And yet every officer has the right to make that decision. And, that example with the Navy, I don't think would happen in the modern world today because despite the rules, there are exceptions, and courts will often recognize the exception. In that case, they should have awarded him honors for saving his ship, but they didn't. But,
okay. Now, I wanted to ask an ad hominem question of Jim. Will you ever, I just don't know this answer, but I just want to know because I'm curious in terms of this subject, but you don't have to answer. If you had been drafted at the time, I think you were too young, but if you had been drafted during the Vietnamese War, would you have gone, or would you have been a conscientious objector?
Well, I was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War.
Oh, I didn't know that, or I forgot. Okay, tell us about it. How your reasoning went.
Well, let's see. How did it go? Well, I could say this, because we sometimes wax biographical. My dad, who during World War II was in Egypt, India, D-Day, and thought that the most action of all was in Murmansk. He thought I had a good paper saying to the draft board why I was going to be a conscientious objector. So I was pleased that he thought that. Now, it was pretty much standard policy during the Vietnam War to bomb whole areas without a clear idea of who was being bombed. And that's a violation of justice in war. But at that time I was really more of a strict pacifist. Oddly enough, given how hard it is to satisfy just war requirements, you don't find yourself that far away from a strict pacifist position in practice. But I do think that there are situations in which force could legitimately be used. It's just that they're few and far between.
Oh, no, but I mean the most obvious one in terms of self-defense is if a man came up to your door with a gun, you would, and you had a gun, which you probably don't, but, you know, you wouldn't think it wrong to shoot, shoot.
I wouldn't. But that's quite apart from the question of war. That's a question of individual self-defense.
No, but a total pacifist would say that it's wrong to kill anyone anytime for any reason. That would be total pacifist.
Yeah,
so you would never that.
No, so I would certainly not take such a position now. In fact, I think that there are some cases in which military force is legitimate, but they're few and far between. And one of the things that we haven't mentioned is that much of what we do in military terms presupposes, now not all, but much of what we do in military terms presupposes that we have a nuclear arsenal. If this happens, that happens. If this, it goes all the way down to, well, we do have this nuclear arsenal. And I think any military policy that we follow through on that depends on the nuclear arsenal is unjustifiable, because I can't think of, unless we're talking about a space station in space, I can't think of a legitimate use of nuclear weapons.
I wrote a paper on that one time, the ethical use of atomic weapons, and the teacher was a pacifist nun, and she gave me an A-, because I made the case.
You got away with words. That just shows.
I made the case. Well, isn't that what the pacifist is doing, and the overcautious philosopher, if I may say? Isn't that just, you know,
got away with words.
defending oneself with words? While they're shooting at you?
I'm all for using your words. We tell the grandchildren when they start to use their fists, use your words, use your words.
Use your word, yeah, right.
But I just wanted to introduce into our discussion that while the Catholic Church does not overlook the moral instability of nuclear weapons, in practice, all great nations accept the necessity of nuclear weapons, and those who can develop an arsenal of nuclear weapons. And insofar as a given action, who knows, there's so many possibilities, but insofar as a given action would not be carried out were it not for, well, we've got nuclear weapons, well, then the whole thing depends on something that's intrinsically wrong, and the whole thing collapses.
Okay, the whole argument about this, which went on, about 20 years ago perhaps, or maybe less, was the question of, is it wrong to have a threat? Is it in itself intrinsically evil to have the threat while trying to gradually go into a nuclear disarmament? So you don't say, if a parent says to a kid, hey, Junior, if you beat up your sister out the door, you'll live on the street. He's probably not going to do that, but the threat in itself is not the same as doing it, et cetera, et cetera. You get into that whole stuff.
That's not a real threat. That's not a real threat. Plus,
but that's what people claim, that what we need to have the threat because we have, but I'd like to go back to, because so many people use World War II as an example, whether World War II in terms of intent on our side was a just war.
I think so.
You do? So it's not as
In
if...
terms of intention, yeah.
So it's when you said there's so few instances, you made
Well,
it sound as if
in terms of
he
the
had
way
the
it was
biggest
carried
war
out.
that any of us have ever heard of.
No, in
It's
terms
not
of how the war was waged, I don't think it was just.
Yeah, that's different. But in itself, I thought you were saying that there could be a just war, but the number would be so small. It made it seem as if you were belittling the evil of that war.
No, I'm not. Because I want to say there's justice in going to war and justice in waging the war. I think in many, many cases there would be a just intention, but in very few cases can there be a just waging of the war, especially when we factor in how often a given policy depends on an appeal to a nuclear arsenal. I think a nuclear arsenal just can't be justified, and if somebody says, well, you might as well cash in all your chips, better to fear God than to fear our enemies and not fear God.
Oh, yes. Okay, so then that brings up one of the huge things that I was thinking about with the poison issue and the Polish Catholic is, I don't know, I wrote to a Polish priest who I know who's a moral theologian about that issue to see what he would say. He's Polish ancestry, but very Polish patriotic, to see what he would say, but he hasn't answered me yet, I think because he's visiting Poland. Anyway, but
hey, you can take a Pole out of Poland, but you can't take Poland out of a Pole.
Right. So, so the thing is that as Christians, we never want to say life on this earth and defense against evil people is such an absolute that you can use any means, because obviously, especially if you keep watching the Passion every Good Friday, you know that the Romans were doing absolutely horrible stuff, and Jesus was not a zealot. The zealots were the ones who thought we have to use any means to get rid of these horrible people, right? Retaliation, justice. They were for justice, and Jesus was presenting Christianity as a totally different thing than a state religion, right?
Yes.
Where we're going to have, so I don't think that one can ever use the argument that the other side is evil, no matter how many facts you amass, that because they're evil, we can use any means to get rid of them.
I think that's true. Now, you frequently refer to class examples, teaching examples, and there's certainly problems with such examples because they eliminate so many variables that in ordinary life can't be eliminated. Although notice in science, there are test cases. I guess they're sometimes called Gedanken, thought experiments, where imagine a situation in which there is no friction. Well, go ahead, imagine it if you can. But in science, these cases are oftentimes presented as well. In that spirit, you might say, look, here we have terrorist X, and terrorist X knows where everything is planted at LAX, and terrorist X won't tell. But from terrorist X's own perspective, he or she, terrorist X, is a freedom fighter and otherwise a devoted family man. But you fortunately have terrorist X's children under your control. And terrorist X, not wanting to frighten his children, have never told them what he does. They have no idea what he's involved in. No way have they contributed to what he's doing, but you have them. And you bring the children in front of terrorist X and bit by bit begin to dismember them. And if somebody says, good God, what are you doing that for? And you say, well, because LAX is going to blow up unless this guy tells us where the weapons are hidden or where the circuits are or where whatever it is. And this is the only way we can do it. Well, it might be that terrorist X cracks because he loves his family. But you can't do that. You just can't do that.
Don't have to.
Does that put you at a disadvantage with terrorism? Yeah, it does put you at a disadvantage with terrorism. Maybe a very serious disadvantage that you're putting yourself at. What I object to oftentimes in lazy left analysis is the refusal to acknowledge what kind of limitations you're actually putting in yourself. If you eliminate nuclear weapons, boy, you are putting yourself at a humongous disadvantage, but you can't use weapons that are indiscriminate.
Well, yeah, let me butt in on this one.
Good, I was waiting for you.
Yeah, well, I was just hanging on to my chair here so I didn't get up and yell like somebody else I know. Mutual assured destruction, which is the political philosophy that it's based on schoolyard beliefs. The bully never attacks the star jock. He always goes to attack the weak person on the campus. In the same way, nations who are aggressive never go after someone who's as strong as they are. They go after the weak nation, as the Russians went into Crimea because Ukraine was relatively quite weak, and as they don't attack us because they know that we'll annihilate them while they're annihilating us. It may sound terrible, but as a matter of fact, it has worked, and has worked for, I don't know, since about 48, 49, 50, somewhere around there. So it's a policy. It sounds like a horror, and yet it has worked beautifully for almost 70 years. Now, there's always a risk, like the satellite that went bad and told the Russians we were attacking, but you can't legislate against accidents. So we're going to run out of time, and I do want to make a couple of other points in defense of the military. First of all, a lot of people think that the military decides when we go to war, and that's absolutely false. War is declared or initiated without declaration by the political leaders that they have voted into office. And a lot of people don't know that. That's why so many of the troops were attacked and spit on, and the rocks were thrown at them when they came back from Vietnam. They were seen as the cause of the war. And in truth, the last person that wants to go to war is a professional military officer because he knows what's coming. And so I want to make that point too in defense of the military. Beyond that, I would suggest that a guy in a foxhole is not sitting in an easy chair, and he's not reading the Catechism, and he's not reading St. Augustine either, or Augustine. He's listening to the bullets whiz past his ear, and if something comes over the brow of his foxhole, he's going to kill it, no matter what it is. And I think, that they often say that there's no atheists in a foxhole, and I think that's pretty much true, except that the atheists probably also went to Canada instead. But whatever.
Yeah, well, this would be true. Like, one of the reasons that we don't think the women who have abortions need to have prison sentences is because the assumption is the person is in such a panic when they themselves are involved that they don't see straight. There are arguments like that go into that question. So the question of what you would do in a foxhole, which is probably not open the Catechism to look up just war theory, you should be familiar with this before, for instance, from the pulpit or from adult catechesis or from high school catechesis. You should be familiar with the types of issues that could come up, especially ones that would involve your own conscience, your own personal decision, etc., etc. Okay, so
well,
nowadays
we have that nice, comfortable possibility because there is no draft. We can simply not go into the military.
Yeah, but suppose you basically want to go into the military for good reasons, that you want to defend your country that you love and you want to defend innocent people in your country. You still have moral issues that you would have to face. For instance, is it a just war? So if you get no catechesis on this, that makes it much harder to, no one thinks that people are going to make the right decision by reading. Well, sometimes people do. From both Jim for maybe 40 years and me for 10 years stood every Saturday in front of abortion clinics trying to bring people out through prayer and talk, not to go in the abortion clinic. And sometimes they read something after we gave them something, because they go in sometimes after the first appointment, then they have an appointment 3 days later to actually have the abortion. So they could, in principle, read something. But, the idea that you're going to kill people all over the world without having ever thought of when it's right or wrong to kill a person within a war situation, for instance, prisoners of war, or, of course, in the military itself, they have classes on these issues, right?
Yes, we do. If we were going to, we don't have the time, but if we went into this extensively, it would be good for the whole panel to read the UCMJ, the Unified Code of Military Justice, because all of this is covered in military law in this country, not in all countries, but certainly in our country. I had the misery of having to study the whole thing years ago, as all officer candidates did. And the very issues that we're talking about are discussed in the UCMJ.
That's very important to realize. So even if we might not agree on the application of the principles, it's not that we hold, well, you just kill anyone when you're in war, and you never ask if it's women or children or innocent people. Now, on the innocent people thing, the issue comes up. I happen to be reading a long book about the Vietnamese War, and the thing is that in a situation where the enemy is using the women and children as hostages while they're fighting, so that you can't kill the soldier without killing the woman and the child, this gets a little more complicated. You can't say...
Yes, it does.
They're just innocent.
And the bombing of Hamburg, World War II, is a good example of that. We leveled that whole city. And the reason was, given the accuracies, even with the Norden bomb site, even with the accuracies we had, we still could not pinpoint the military factories and leave the neighborhoods intact. We had to clean out the whole place to get rid of the military production. And nobody liked doing it, but we sure did do it. And I know a guy that personally was a little child and survived the bombing of Hamburg. But that's a whole other story. Again, running almost out of time. I'd like to mention a woman, a nun, that I met while I was at Seattle University. She was a fellow classmate. She was so enraged that we went into Vietnam that she renounced her U.S. citizenship and went off to Chile. Big mistake, because she wound up in Chile at the beginnings of the Pinochet regime, where they were arresting people in the dark, taking them away, and never seen, torturing them, murdering them, and putting them in mass graves, and the people were never seen again. She lived through that horror because she didn't like the fact that we were fighting in Vietnam. So she was a classmate because she was on a green card or a student visa, in her own country, and she would have to leave and go back to Chile as soon as our classwork was over.
God bless her. Lord have mercy on her.
Yeah, yeah.
What obviously we can all see is how complex this subject is, but very important. So I happen to be reading a huge book by George Weigel. George Weigel is the one who wrote this enormous biography of John Paul II, the definitive biography of him. And he wrote this book on this very subject, but I started reading it because of this program, but I only got to page 50 so far. And it's called Tranquilitas Ordinis, the Present Failure and Future Promise of American Catholic Thought on War and Peace. Now, he's a man who's conservative religiously, very magisterial, but probably not a Republican, let's say. So it's a very interesting book, but he insists the fact that it's so horrible, complex, and difficult doesn't mean that we should throw our hands up and just say, well, leave it to individual conscience. It's enormously important that because of the horrors of war, which everybody, as you point out, Al, the people in the armed forces know better than we do, than Jim and I do for sure, as philosophy professors, that it's so horrible what happens in war that we need to keep talking, thinking, and bring everything to bear on how to avoid war. Or if we can't, at least try to avoid perpetrating such evils, right?
That seems right to me.
I guess it's whether you're sitting in the foxhole or not, but anyway. It is complex, that's for sure.
Yes, but the military doesn't say, since you're not going to read the military rules when you're in the foxhole, you don't have to read it when you're in training.
Yeah, the question is between the officer corps and the enlisted. I don't know. You see, I don't know whether the enlisted are required to read it. I imagine some of the senior non-coms have read it, and some perhaps had courses in it. But the truth that's likely to be in the foxhole is probably not read it. But nevertheless, his command has studied it. And
no, but I mean, doesn't he have not read the whole document, but certainly there must be some manual given to, if this was available to me from the ROTC, this was some sort of basic manual that all the students were reading.
I would imagine, I don't know this, but I would assume that the basic principles are mentioned in basic training. Yes, I do. They would have to be mentioned because at the same time you're teaching people to follow commands, you have to at least open the question of what if you get an illegal or an immoral command, and so I'm sure that's covered.
2 minutes,
perhaps in summary, but covered.
2 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. So, next week. Next week is a question of the host, the body and blood of Christ, and the question is, how can we be sure that the host, the communion, really is the body and blood of Christ and not simply a wafer of bread and a nice drink of wine? How can we be so sure that it is really the body and blood of Christ once it's consecrated at the altar by a priest? So that's the issue for next week, because there are many in the world who deny it.
This was a beautiful discussion. Thank all of you. Jim, Rhonda, Commander Al. I know I learned a lot, so thank you very much.
And we didn't fight.
No.
Pun intended.
Right. So we'll see you next week, same time, same station with the open door. And in the meantime, may God bless each and every one of you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
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 Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.